Yes. So I have the pleasure to introduce Tomas, Dr. Tomas Gonzalez Zarzar. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Neurology and the Institute for Biological and Medical Engineering at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. Dr. Gonzalez Zarzar obtained his degree in biological anthropology at the University of Chile and his PhD in biological anthropology and bioethics at Pennsylvania State University. He completed his postdoctoral research at the beginning of 2023 at the Department of Medical Science at Penn State. His research focuses on understanding genetic, molecular, and environmental factors' contribution to complex human diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and their sex-gender differences. On the other hand, his research in bioethics is focused on the genomic studies in indigenous peoples and environmental justice. So yeah, we're welcoming Tomas into the space, and thank you so much for being here today. Yes.
Okay, so hi everyone, and again, thanks Epifania for that introduction, and thanks the organizers for this webinar. I'm really excited to be here. So today I wanted to talk about the work that we've been doing with a group of colleagues. We call ourselves Ciencia y Comunidades, or Science and Communities, and this group started a few years ago, so we've been working together for a while now. And thus, the title of this talk, Echoes of Ancestry, Exploring Genetics and Identity Through Community Dialogues. So I will frame this talk in three broad sections. First, the motivation that we as a group had to start working on these topics. Second, I will show you the discussions that we had as a group that led to some publications and commentary pieces, particularly to understand or to bring a framework to understand what was this motivation in terms of what was going on in the region, particularly in Latin America, with respect to genomic studies. And finally, I will talk about the workshops that we held here in Chile and a few lessons that we learned through these events. So first, I wanted to show you the whole team. This is Ciencia y Comunidades. We're a group of colleagues. We're all anthropologists. We knew each other from before, but we had similar research interests. So we started to gravitate towards very similar questions. So that was the thing that brought us together. We had different opinions on different matters. So whatever I say today is not as a representative of the group, but as myself. So first, the motivation, right? Genomic research has a problem with genetic diversity. Probably it's not news anymore that most genomic research has been done with participants from particular regions, with particular genetic ancestries. And the solution has been to purposefully sample and target regions with poor representation, including indigenous peoples. And one of the first intuitions, so we had two intuitions and motivations for the work that we started to develop. The first intuition that we had is that most genomic research in Latin America that dealt with the problem of genomic diversity, and in Chile in particular, have been equating cultural groups with genetic ancestry, right? Which in our perspective was problematic in several ways. It also, if you track down, I don't know, papers from the 90s, the beginning of the 2000s, there was also a lot of confusion on what to name particular groups. For example, there are interesting papers that call people from Rapa Nui, from Easter Island, they call them Maori. They use kind of inconsistent labels based on either one or two last names and stuff like that. So that was our first intuition that something, it's kind of weird or problematic in some way. Also, the next motivation and intuition that we had with respect to the corpus of genomic research in the area is that most studies had as a major goal to associate genetic ancestry with particular phenotypes, right? Mostly diseases. We're talking about biomedical projects mostly, and not particular genomic regions, right? Which will be your typical genome-wide association study. So we saw that and then associating that with a particular disease. Set to comment on a framework that either implicitly or explicitly has been in constant conversation with the genomic studies in the region. And that's the concept of mestizaje, which simply translates to admixture, right? But it carries a very significant socio-political implication in Latin America. So we started from the fact that scientific research is not outside of socio-political issues, but rather is completely embedded in them. So Latin America has a long and complicated relationship with race, one that differs significantly from the racial categorizations used in other countries. And particularly, if there is something significant about race in a lot of Latin American countries, is the erasure of it. Most folks in Latin America will say that race is not an issue in their country, probably compared to the US, and that other salient demographic characteristics are more relevant, like social class, education, and so on. And yet, and this is kind of the relevant thing, national identity projects across Latin America are deeply racialized, most notably through the ideology of mestizaje, right? If we understand mestizaje as an ideology of race, all national identity projects in Latin America are formed through this ideology. So mestizaje became the dominant narrative of identity formation in many Latin American countries after independence. And I'm showing you here the casta painting. So this is a 18th century painting. So this is before independence, right? So this is in the midst of the Spanish Empire. But it's to highlight probably how obsessed the Spanish Empire was with the issue of race, and particularly with mestizaje, with that mixture. I keep seeing this painting, and I keep seeing how, not little, but how we haven't moved forward in some ways, right? So this is kind of an admixture plot, right? So this is only telling you how much percentage of ancestry you have from certain ancestries, right? So it's in a way very telling that we're keep reproducing the same frameworks, and that was kind of our intention in some commentary pieces that we made. How we're still reproducing some of the same frameworks that brought us here. So mestizaje became again the dominant narrative of identity formation in Latin America after independence. It was promoted as a unifying project, proposing that Latin American populations emerge from the biological and cultural blending of indigenous European and African ancestry. And while it was framed as an inclusive, this ideology has supported two contradictory discourses. There are often reproducing genomics, right? Two contradictory elements, I will say. One is the mestizo as the homogeneous figure of this nation building project, and also the idealized notion of indigenous genetic purism. And we say contradictory, and I say contradictory, but these two elements necessitate each other. You cannot have a mestizo, an homogeneous figure, without the presence of, in some way of a pure kind of indigenous idea, right? And these contradictions can also be understood through other elements. So we're making kind of some analogies here. For example, with what has been called the dialectic of racial hypervisibility and invisibility. On the one hand, indigenous identity becomes hypervisible in national symbolism, right? They are celebrated in folk festivals. They are celebrated in patriotic narratives, right? So the character of the nation and so on. And on the other hand, they become invisible. Indigenous peoples' political rights, cultural practices, and demands for self-determination are consistently erased. So you have that dialectic of hypervisibility and invisibility that play along these two contradictory elements of mestizo as the homogeneous figure but also with the need of this indigenous genetic purism. So genomics, despite being presented as an objective scientific domain, often reproduces and reinforces these ideological elements or contradictions. In fact, the language and logic of genetic admixture directly echo the mestizo discourse. On one hand, admixture is used to generate a hierarchy of indigeneity, implying that individuals with more indigenous DNA are more indigenous. On the other, admixture serves to dissolve this indigenous difference, framing the mestizo as a new unified genetic identity that overshadows or eliminates the specificity of indigenous peoples. So a lot of research that has been done in the region in Latin America will say we're all mestizos, right? But at the same time, identifying that some are more mestizo than others. For example, in Chile, studies on indigenous groups such as the Mapuche and Aymara have frequently sought to connect their genetic ancestry with health risks. And I will go back to this painting because I like it a lot. So, for example, in Chile, studies on indigenous groups such as the Mapuche and Aymara have frequently sought to connect their genetic ancestry with health risks, susceptibility to gallbladder cancer, metabolic disorders, and so on. And while such research is often framed as beneficial for public health, its political and social consequences are troubling. And I will go back to that point at the end, because it first equates ethnicity with genetic ancestry, reducing cultural belonging to DNA, and also making that equation that it's kind of the hallmark of scientific racism, right? Which is biology is equal to culture. And it associates both with health risks, reinforcing essentialist assumptions about biological differences. So another concept that we like to bring here is the concept of bounded justice. So in this context, bounded justice refers to inclusion that is superficial, conditioned, or limited, right? Efforts to be inclusive that fail to address the deeper social and historical structures that produce the inequality in first place. So a lot of the examples that we bring into our commentary pieces are examples of bounded justice, studies that want to address an inequality that exists in terms of health risks, for example, but they always fail to address the deeper social and deeper structural issues that bring forth that particular inequality. So in the case of genomics and mestizaje, bounded justice occurs when indigenous participation is invited, but the terms of recognition are still determined by dominant scientific frameworks. So this is the background. This was the motivation first, and then kind of the framework that we used to understand what was going on in the region. And our challenge was to how can we create spaces to discuss these issues, right? To discuss genetics, to discuss identity, and to discuss these contradictions that we saw in a lot of studies openly. How can we make genomics and genomic studies more reflective, more dialogical, right? And so that brings me to the final part of this talk, which is the Genómica e Identidades workshops. So in 2022 and 2023, we organized as a team these two workshops under the name Genómica e Identidades, Genomics and Identities. They were held in Santiago and Villarrica, which is a small city in the south of Chile. The flyer on the left, that's the one in 2022. The flyer on the right, that's the one in 2023. And these workshops were funded by grants from the University of Chicago and the Universidad Católica in Chile. Those are two pictures from the groups, from the workshops, right? One, the 2022 on the left, 2023 on the right. On the left, that was Santiago, winter, very clouded days, very cold days. The one on the right was in the south of Chile, summer. So you can see that we have better weather in there, clear skies. It was really beautiful. So the aim of these workshops were to design spaces to facilitate and promote dialogue and learning about genetic research with indigenous peoples in Chile. Sorry. So we we brought people from different indigenous communities, from several indigenous communities, all throughout Chile to a single place, right? To Santiago, to Villarrica, to discuss these issues, right? So we had a combination of talks, right? Discussion sessions and activities. I think the most kind of rewarding aspect of these workshops were actually the discussion sections and activities. I think also for the participants, those were the highlights of these workshops. Um, in terms of the talks, we had basic concepts in genetics and genomics, the history of the discipline, the history of genomic research in Chile, right, which is not, it's kind of recent, right, and also the contextualization of research practices in Chile and worldwide. We also had to overcome several challenges. The first one is the mistrust. A lot of people do not participate or didn't want to participate in these workshops because they either don't trust in the researchers. A lot of people from indigenous communities in Chile that actually don't trust anthropologists very specifically because they've had experiences with anthropologists, not only biological anthropologists, but also cultural anthropologists that come to their communities, do their research, they leave and they never come back. They don't establish any sort of relationship with the community after their kind of research, right? And also because some people thought that these workshops were kind of a novel way to collect samples. And a lot of folks joked at the end of the workshops with us when we had a more trusting relationship. They will say, "Okay, when do we give you our samples? When do we give you our blood or saliva and stuff like that?" But this was never the intention of the workshops, right? It was a space this to discuss these issues. I will move forward in the sake of time, right? Because I wanted to highlight two kind of very specific examples that call my attention. So we had participants with a wide range of views, as well as shared experiences. These were diverse participants from diverse indigenous groups, occupation, ages. We had from retired folks to undergrad students. So it was really impressive to have such a wide range age variation in our participants. We also had invited speakers to talk about similar situations in the US, in Mexico, in Argentina, and India. And it also worked to strengthen Latin American networks, not only between researchers, but also between indigenous communities, which was really, really great. So there were two instances that I found fascinating from these workshops that I wanted to highlight and bring to your attention. At least how we frame, or at least how I frame my talks, was a very critical stance towards genomic science. Probably I was more kind of I was very biased towards kind of being very critical of genomic studies, but it called my attention how nuanced the participants were in terms of highlighting the benefits and the value of genomic science as well, particularly to reclaim erased histories, and that I think spoke volumes in terms of how the fractures of memories can also highlight the value that genomic science can have in indigenous groups, particularly to reclaim their own histories and to learn more about their particular population history. And also another key example that I wanted to highlight was we had one activity where we collected news articles, national news articles from genomic studies done in the country. And the activity consisted we formed groups of participants. We gave each group a particular news article, and we had motivating questions that they will answer to kind of delve deeper into the analysis of the news article. And we also gave them freedom to discuss whatever they found interesting about the news article. So one very incisive comment was when a group noticed how during the description in the news article that referenced the genetic ancestry of a particular group, it was always made with respect to a negative trait, either a disease, unwanted kind of a negative behavioral trait, and so on. So that also spoke volumes in terms of how a particular study can be taken by a newspaper, right? And what are those consequences in terms of stereotypes, in terms of associating a particular group with a particular disease and so on. So we think that these workshops, and I will finish right now. So we think that these workshops show that community engagement in genomics must go far beyond informed consent, right? It must be relational, it must be situated, and it should be built through dialogue. Thank you.